Dr. Mehmet Oz, made famous by Oprah and by his own daytime talk show, has been tapped by President-elect Trump to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
At 83 years old, Dr. Mehmet Oz, the man once trusted by millions as America's doctor, is living a reality few could have predicted. His story, once marked by triumph, innovation, and the bright lights of television, has shifted into something far darker, far more tragic. For decades, audiences looked to him for advice on how to live longer, healthier, and happier lives. He had it all: the career, the fame, the family, and the admiration of the public. Yet today, what remains is not a tale of glory, but of heartbreak. His legacy is fractured, his reputation questioned, and his dreams of influence shattered by choices that spiraled beyond control. The tragedy of Dr. Oz isn't found in a single downfall. It lies in how a man who once stood at the pinnacle of trust and authority has become a figure clouded in controversy, loneliness, and regret. This is the untold story of Dr. Oz's rise, his fall, and the heartbreaking reality of his life at 83. Before the controversies, before the politics, before the heartbreak of his later years, Mehmet Cengiz Oz was a young man with a burning ambition. Born on June 11, 1960, in Cleveland, Ohio, to Turkish immigrants, he grew up straddling two worlds. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunity, instilling in him discipline, faith, and an unshakable belief that success could be achieved through relentless effort. As a boy, Oz excelled in academics, driven by a curiosity about the human body and the mysteries of health. By the time he attended Harvard University, his brilliance was unmistakable. He went on to earn a joint MD and MBA from the University of Pennsylvania. Setting him apart as more than just a physician, he was a strategist, a communicator, and, above all, a visionary. In the medical world, Dr. Oz quickly established himself as a gifted cardiothoracic surgeon. At New York Presbyterian Hospital, he pioneered advanced procedures, earning respect from colleagues and gratitude from patients whose lives he saved on the operating table. But while his surgical skills were undeniable, it was his charisma that made him different. Patients described him not as cold or clinical, but as warm, engaging, and deeply human. He could explain complex medical conditions in a way that calmed fears. His colleagues noticed his rare ability to speak to people, not just operate on them. This talent would become the foundation of everything that followed. The turning point came when Oprah Winfrey discovered him. In the early 2000s, Oprah introduced Dr. Oz to her massive audience, giving him a platform unlike anything the medical world had ever seen. On her show, Oz was magnetic. He took medical jargon and translated it into plain, relatable language. He demonstrated procedures with props, used metaphors that clicked instantly with viewers, and carried himself with a confidence that made audiences trust him implicitly. Viewers weren't just learning from a doctor, they were learning from someone who felt like family, someone who genuinely wanted to help them live better. By 2009, the Dr. Oz Show was born. It exploded onto daytime television, reaching millions daily. His stage presence was unmatched. He was a physician, a teacher, and an entertainer rolled into one. Audiences hung on his every word, from tips about diet and exercise to insights about mental health and longevity. Ratings soared, and with them, his influence grew. Books, magazine covers, and public speaking engagements followed. He wasn't just a doctor anymore, he was a brand. For a time, his name carried the same trust as the Mayo Clinic or the American Heart Association. He became America's doctor, the authority figure people turned to for answers about life and health. At the height of this rise, Dr. Oz represented the American dream in its purest form. An immigrant's son, a world-class surgeon, And now a beloved television star, he appeared unstoppable. But as history has shown time and again, the higher a person climbs, the more dangerous the fall. And for Dr. Oz, the seeds of tragedy were already quietly being planted in the soil of success. Dr. Oz's fame grew like wildfire, consuming television screens across America and soon the entire globe. What began as a few appearances on Oprah's stage transformed into a syndicated empire known simply as The Dr. Oz Show. By its second season, it wasn't just a program, it was a phenomenon. Daytime audiences tuned in religiously, hanging on his every word. His blend of medical authority and showmanship made him irresistible. He was the doctor who didn't just lecture. He entertained, he engaged, he performed. He would pull out oversized models of hearts, intestines, or arteries, demonstrating with vivid clarity how the body worked and how people could protect themselves from illness. Viewers loved it. For the first time, medicine didn't feel intimidating. It felt accessible. Ratings soared, and with each episode, Dr. Oz's influence spread further. Soon, his face was on magazine covers, his books dominated bestseller lists, and his appearances on late-night television made him more of a celebrity than a surgeon. With his warm smile, polished delivery, and ability to simplify health into actionable tips, he became not only a household name, but a trusted figure in living rooms from New York to Los Angeles. His show won Emmy Awards, solidifying his role as America's doctor. But with every accolade came new pressures. The show had to keep producing content 5 days a week, year after year, meaning Oz and his team were in a constant race to deliver fresh, engaging, and dramatic material. Health advice had to be repackaged into television moments, snappy, bold, and memorable. It wasn't enough to talk about diet. It had to be the revolutionary new diet. It wasn't enough to warn against disease. It had to be the hidden danger lurking in your kitchen or your bathroom cabinet. The demands of television began to shape the very way he communicated medicine. For networks and sponsors, Dr. Oz was golden. His endorsements boosted product sales overnight, his advice influenced millions of consumers, and his platform was a money machine. But quietly, some in the medical community were beginning to voice concerns. Was Oz oversimplifying medicine to chase ratings? Was he walking the fine line between education and entertainment? Inside the walls of the hospital, some colleagues whispered that he was more showman than surgeon, more celebrity than doctor. Yet in the eyes of the public, he remained untouchable. Mothers trusted him with their children's health. Seniors followed his advice as gospel, and countless viewers adjusted their diets, lifestyles, and habits based on what he said on screen. At his peak, Dr. Oz wasn't just a man. He was an empire, a global brand synonymous with wellness. But what no one realized at the time was that this very fame, the fame that gave him power beyond imagination, would also plant the seeds of his greatest downfall. For in the world of television, the spotlight burns bright, but it can also scorch. As the seasons of his show rolled on, the cracks in Dr. Oz's shining image began to show, and they came not from his charisma, but from the very advice he gave to millions. At first, the headlines celebrated him as the doctor who made health accessible, but soon, those same headlines began questioning his credibility. Viewers who once followed his tips without hesitation started hearing whispers from experts who accused him of promoting unproven remedies and sensational claims. The tipping point came when Dr. Oz began endorsing what he called miracle solutions, weight loss supplements, exotic herbs, and pills that promised to change lives instantly. These segments brought excitement to television, but raised red flags among scientists and medical boards. Critics charged that he was abandoning the rigor of evidence-based medicine in favor of flashy sound bites designed to boost ratings and sell products. To the casual viewer, his words carried authority, but to professionals, it looked like a betrayal of his oath as a doctor. The controversy hit its peak when the United States Senate summoned Dr. Oz for questioning. In a highly publicized hearing, senators grilled him on his promotion of unverified supplements. Clips of the exchange went viral. One of America's most trusted doctors now stood accused of misleading the very people who admired him. He defended himself, insisting his goal was to give people hope. But for many, the damage was done. His name, once a symbol of trust, became tied to the idea of pseudoscience. Behind the cameras, the criticism only intensified. Major journals published articles challenging his recommendations. Medical colleagues publicly distanced themselves, and watchdog groups accused him of exploiting vulnerable audiences. Yet even as the storm grew, the machine of television demanded more. Each day's episode required fresh hooks, dramatic angles, and bold claims. The line between entertainment and medical integrity blurred, and Dr. Oz often found himself crossing it. In the eyes of his most loyal fans, he was still the doctor they turned to for guidance. But in the broader medical world, his reputation was being dismantled piece by piece. The very platform that had made him a household name was now turning into a stage of relentless scrutiny. By the mid-2010s, his image had split into two extremes. For millions of viewers, he remained a trusted voice of hope. But for critics, he had become the face of medical misinformation. This fracture marked a permanent shift in his career. No longer was he celebrated without question. He was a polarizing figure, defended passionately by some and condemned fiercely by others. And for Dr. Oz, the battle between preserving his empire and preserving his credibility would haunt him for the rest of his life. If controversy over his medical advice had shaken his reputation, Dr. Oz's decision to step into the brutal arena of politics would all but shatter it. By the early 2020s, as his television influence began to wane and his once glittering image lost its shine, he made a gamble few expected. He announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate, seeking to represent Pennsylvania. For a man who had spent decades crafting a persona as America's doctor, the move into partisan politics stunned both supporters and critics. What followed was one of the most contentious campaigns in recent memory. Almost immediately, questions swirled around his residency. Opponents seized on the fact that he had lived for years in New Jersey, accusing him of being an outsider parachuting into Pennsylvania politics. Viral videos mocked him, reporters dissected every move he made, and the very charisma that had once won over millions of daytime viewers suddenly looked out of place in town halls and debates. His opponents painted him as out of touch with everyday people, a wealthy television personality trying to buy credibility. The media, which had once courted his appearances, now savaged him with endless headlines questioning not only his political positions but also his medical past. Old controversies resurfaced. Clips of him endorsing miracle cures were replayed on the news. Critics accused him of chasing fame rather than service, and his medical career became ammunition for attack ads. The more he campaigned, the more his vulnerabilities were exposed. He struggled to shed the image of being a television celebrity, and every misstep became fodder for ridicule. One infamous video of him shopping for groceries, awkwardly misnaming items and fumbling through casual conversation, became a viral symbol of disconnect, reinforcing the narrative that he didn't understand the lives of ordinary voters. For Dr. Oz, the campaign was grueling. Once adored by audiences who saw him as a trusted figure, in their living rooms, he now faced hecklers, sharp critics, and a political machine determined to portray him as a fraud. The election results were crushing. After months of relentless battles, he lost decisively, a defeat that not only ended his political ambitions but permanently stained his legacy. For someone who had built a life on credibility, authority, and influence, the loss was more than political. It was personal. His campaign had opened him up to ridicule on a scale he had never endured before, and in the aftermath, he was left facing the reality that both the medical community and the political world no longer embraced him. What was supposed to be his next great chapter had instead exposed his deepest weaknesses, leaving him vulnerable, diminished, and heartbroken. Behind the cameras, beyond the headlines, and away from the political stage, Dr. Oz faced struggles that cut even deeper than public ridicule, struggles within his own family. For decades, he had cultivated the image of a devoted husband and father, a man who balanced his demanding career with a strong family life. His marriage to Lisa Oz, whom he wed in 1985, had been a cornerstone of his public persona. Together they raised 4 children, often appearing in glossy magazine spreads as the picture of success. But as his fame grew, so too did the pressures that fame brought into his home. The constant demands of television production meant long hours, travel, and endless commitments that pulled him away from the private world of family dinners and quiet evenings. Lisa, a strong and outspoken figure in her own right, reportedly grew weary of living in the shadow of Dr. Oz's larger-than-life persona. Whispers emerged that his relentless pursuit of fame and influence created tension, with disagreements over how much he was sacrificing for the spotlight. His children, too, were caught in the glare of fame. Daphne Oz, his most visible child, built her own career in television and wellness, but with that came comparisons, pressures, and the burden of living up to the family name. Others in the family preferred privacy, but privacy was a luxury Dr. Oz could no longer afford. As the Senate campaign raged on, political opponents dragged his family into the battlefield. Reporters camped outside their homes, tabloids spread rumors, and every personal detail became public property. The strain was immense. Those who knew the family privately said that the campaign years were among the most painful, not just because of political defeat, but because of the fractures it revealed at home. The man who had once built his image on family values was now seen by many as a man torn between ambition and the people who loved him most. By the time Dr. Oz reached his 80s, the weight of these sacrifices had become undeniable. Family gatherings that once seemed joyous were quieter now, more distant, clouded by the years of controversy and division. Though they stood by him publicly, the scars of decades spent chasing fame and battling criticism remained beneath the surface. The tragedy of Dr. Oz is not just about public downfall, it is also about the private toll. The father, the husband, the man behind the white coat, learned that when the lights fade and the cameras turn away, it is the family that must live with the consequences of the choices he made in pursuit of greatness. For years, Dr. Oz was a fixture on daytime television, a man whose name carried the weight of authority and whose face was instantly recognizable across America. But as the controversies mounted and his failed political bid left his reputation bruised, the very networks that once celebrated him began to retreat. His show, which had once won multiple Emmy Awards and dominated daytime ratings, came to a quiet and unceremonious end. The cancellation was a symbolic blow, a final reminder that the empire he had built on trust and charisma was no longer wanted in the same way it once was. Producers moved on to new personalities. Networks sought fresher faces. And the slot he had occupied for over a decade was filled without fanfare. For Dr. Oz, whose life had revolved around the rhythm of daily filming, rehearsals, and the constant hum of production, The silence was deafening. The stage lights went out, the cameras stopped rolling, and the applause that had once been routine was replaced by an unsettling void. Attempts at making public appearances after his political loss fell flat. Former allies in the media kept their distance, wary of attaching themselves to a figure who had become so polarizing. Invitations to talk shows dried up, endorsements vanished, and even medical conferences, where he had once been a keynote speaker, began looking elsewhere. It was as if an unspoken pact had been made to quietly exile him from the mainstream. The pain of this exile was not only professional, but deeply personal. For a man who thrived on audience connection, who built his identity around being seen, heard, and trusted, the loss of a platform was devastating. He had spent decades teaching people how to live longer, healthier lives, and now, at 83, he was forced to confront the irony that his own legacy was being shortened not by illness, but by rejection. Fans still existed, pockets of loyal viewers who defended him online and remembered the comfort his show once brought. But they were no longer the majority. The cultural tide had turned. The trusted America's doctor was now a relic of another era, spoken of more in the past tense than the present. The once unstoppable machine of television had chewed him up and spit him out, leaving him to fade into the background. And perhaps most haunting of all was the realization that this exile wasn't temporary. Networks rarely resurrect controversial figures whose reputations have been so badly damaged. For Dr. Oz, the curtain had fallen for good, and the stage where he once reigned was now nothing more than a memory of what had been. As the years pressed on, the silence surrounding Dr. Oz grew heavier, and what once felt like temporary exile began to settle into something permanent. For a man who had lived under the constant glare of cameras and thrived on the validation of millions, the absence of that daily audience left an emptiness that could not be filled. At 83, the halls of fame he once walked felt distant, and the roar of applause was replaced by the quiet hum of solitude. Friends from his television years drifted away, moving on to other projects and new faces. Colleagues from the medical community, many of whom had distanced themselves during the height of his controversies, rarely reached out. Even within social circles, there was a sense of isolation. The man who once embodied charm and confidence now found himself on the sidelines of conversations he used to lead. Those closest to him spoke of how he still carried himself with grace, but behind his eyes lingered the unmistakable shadow of regret. Loneliness became his most persistent companion. Without the endless schedule of filming, without the back-to-back interviews and public appearances, there was too much time to think, time to reflect on the choices that led him here. Late nights once spent preparing for television segments were now consumed with memories of headlines that mocked him, congressional hearings that humiliated him, and election results that broke him. He had lived for decades at the center of attention, and now he was forced to confront the reality of fading relevance. Even loyal fans who still admired him were fewer and quieter, their voices drowned out by the overwhelming chorus of criticism that had defined his later years. His legacy, once built on saving lives in the operating room and inspiring healthier living through his show, was overshadowed by a reputation scarred with accusations of pseudoscience and political failure. For Dr. Oz, the silence wasn't simply the absence of noise, it was the sound of being forgotten. The world he had given so much to had moved on, leaving him behind as a reminder of how quickly the tide of public opinion can turn. He had chased influence and power with unmatched energy, but in the end, the price was steep. Fame had given him everything, and yet, in his old age, it left him lonelier than he had ever been before. At 83, Dr. Mehmet Oz's life stands as a haunting reminder of how triumph and tragedy can intertwine, how a man who once commanded trust from millions can end his journey shrouded in doubt, loneliness, and regret. His story is not that of a criminal or a villain, but of a man whose pursuit of influence carried him down a path from which there was no return. In the quiet moments of reflection, when the cameras are gone and the spotlight has long since dimmed, he is left to reconcile with the fragments of a legacy that was once destined for greatness. He began his career as a healer, a surgeon, who held the beating hearts of patients in his hands and gave them a second chance at life. Those early victories in the operating room are still remembered by those who lived because of him. And yet, for the broader public, those accomplishments have been eclipsed by the controversies of his later years. When his name is mentioned now, it is rarely with reverence for his surgical innovations, but more often with skepticism about the supplements he endorsed or ridicule about the political campaign that ended in humiliation. For Dr. Oz, this is the greatest tragedy. Not that he failed, but that his successes are overshadowed, his story rewritten by the harsh judgment of public memory. Fame, as he has learned, is a merciless companion. It lifts you to the highest peaks, where applause drowns out doubt and admiration blinds you to warning signs. But fame is also fleeting, and when it fades, it leaves behind a silence so heavy it can crush even the strongest spirits. Dr. Oz, once the trusted voice of health and wellness, now sits in that silence, forced to watch as the world moves on without him. His empire is gone, his influence diminished, and his legacy fractured. And yet, there is a deeper tragedy still, because at the heart of his downfall is a man who never stopped wanting to help, but who allowed ambition and the relentless demands of entertainment to cloud his judgment. In chasing ratings, he diluted his credibility. In chasing power, he sacrificed trust. And in chasing relevance, he lost the very thing that made him beloved in the first place: authenticity. His story now serves as a cautionary tale, not just for doctors or celebrities, but for anyone who believes they can hold on to the fleeting nature of fame forever. It shows how one misstep, amplified under the unforgiving glare of media, can unravel decades of work, how ambition unchecked can corrode integrity, and how even the brightest lights can flicker out when the world decides to turn away. For his fans, the heartbreak lies in seeing the man they once trusted reduced to a symbol of what happens when credibility is traded for attention. For his critics, the tragedy lies in wasted potential, in the knowledge that a brilliant surgeon with the gift of communication could have been a transformative voice for health had he resisted the temptations of television spectacle and politics. And for Dr. Oz himself, the heartbreak lies in solitude, in the long nights of remembering what once was and realizing it may never return. At 83, he is not the confident, smiling doctor who captivated audiences, but a man confronting the fragility of legacy. His tragedy is not in dying young or in scandal alone. It is in living long enough to see his life's work questioned, his reputation diminished, and his story rewritten as a cautionary tale rather than a celebration. The final chapter of Dr. Oz is not one of triumph, but of reflection, of a man staring into the mirror of history and seeing not the healer he once was, but the controversies that defined his fall. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth of all is that this fate was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, of compromises, of ambition that outpaced caution. Choices that now, at the twilight of his life, leave him with nothing but memories of what might have been, and the heavy weight of knowing that the world will remember him less for the lives he saved, and more for the empire he lost.